4 months after the UK voted to leave the European Union, the fallout from Brexit is starting to bite. And it involves the country's love affair with Marmite. British supermarket Tesco pulled a range of products, including Marmite, from its online store after a row over pricing. Unilever, one of the major food suppliers, wanted to raise prices by 10% to offset the falling value of the pound. The Marmite pricing dispute has been settled, and the British staple is back on supermarket shelves. But the pressure of rising prices hasn't gone away. The pound has fallen around 15% against the dollar and the euro since the Brexit vote. That's given a big boost to exporters. And it's made the UK a cheaper destination for foreign tourists. But many economists warn that the currency dive will bring more harm than good in a country that imports more than half of its food and nearly half of its energy.
We will invoke Article 50 no later than the end of March next year.
It was these comments by Prime Minister Theresa May last month that sent the pound plunging. The signal that she will start the formal process of leaving the EU, and in doing so, start the clock on a 2-year countdown to finalize a Brexit deal. But there's still no clarity on what the deal will actually look like. A so-called hard Brexit would likely involve pulling out of the single market and ending free movement of people from Europe, a key demand for those who campaign to leave the EU. Or there could be a so-called soft Brexit, in which many of the existing relationships between the UK and the EU are preserved, especially economic and trade ties. But the EU would most likely demand free movement of people in return, an issue the Prime Minister has indicated is not up for discussion.
Yes, the United Kingdom will be a fully independent sovereign country, free to make our own decisions on a whole host of different issues, such as how we choose to control immigration. But we still want to trade freely in goods and services with Europe.
The Prime Minister's position appears to be hardening. And so is the position of European leaders.
Moi, je l'ai dit très fermement. Madame Theresa May veut un Brexit dur, la négociation sera dure.
And while Theresa May has a fight on her hands in Brussels, another battle is emerging back home in the courts. Judges are expected to rule by December whether it's even legal for the government to trigger Article 50 without a vote by Parliament. And if Parliament does get to vote, the question won't be over a hard or soft Brexit, but it will revert to the question of whether Brexit should happen at all. Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from London is Alan Craig. He is a Brexit activist and a member of the UK Independence Party, or UKIP. And from Strasbourg, I'm joined by Jean Lambert. She's a member of the European Parliament representing London for the Green Party. Thanks both so much for joining us. We've heard that soundbite of Prime Minister Theresa May 100 times saying Brexit means Brexit. It's in everyone's head. But as that report just pointed out, it's actually now up to the court to decide if Brexit can legally move forward without a parliamentary vote, as the referendum was actually non-binding. Alan Craig, what will happen if the court rules against Brexit without a parliamentary vote?
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, the legal process takes its toll and takes its time, and we'll have to see. I think at the end of the day, though, the legal process and the parliamentary process, and of course Parliament has to be involved in it, neither of those are in a position to reverse or stop the decision of the British people on the 23rd of June. It was a clear message: we want to come out of the EU. Full stop. That means out of all the structures, out of all the agreements, out of everything else that ties us within there. We want our country back. And that was the decision. The British people were asked, and the British people spoke. It couldn't be clearer. So we'll have to wait and see. I mean, there's all this hard Brexit, soft Brexit, Brexit light and slower going on. It's all just posturing and guessing. We really don't know at the moment. The negotiation hasn't started, and I wait to see what happens during the negotiations.
Okay, Jean Lambert, do you think it's the court's duty to, in a sense, prevent this referendum, non-binding referendum, from being implemented?
Well, I think that what the court is trying to do is not say whether or not it should be implemented. It's saying, you know, what are the bodies that should be engaged in this, and whether a referendum, if you know, as you've pointed out, it's non-binding, but nevertheless, government is very clear it's accepted the results. Whether it can be simply left to the Prime Minister and her cabinet to even decide what it is we're trying to put on the table, and therefore the role of Parliament in this is absolutely crucial. And I think that those who would argue that they want to leave the European Union to so-called take back control didn't mean that they were simply going to hand it over to Theresa May. It's about the Parliament being engaged in looking at what is it we're putting on the table, what's the process of the deal, and at the end of the day, is that deal good enough?
Ellen, go ahead if you had a comment. If not, I wanted to point out that...
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. We elect Parliament, and Parliament has a job to do. Parliament must be involved in some way. I mean, Parliament's involved in keeping the government to account. Parliament's involved in passing legislation that the government wants passed and so on. So I don't think we'd want to bypass Parliament. That would be a sort of denial of the sort of representative democracy we have. My only caveat on that is clearly a majority of the MPs are Remainers and want to stay in. I wouldn't give them the right, or there'd be flaming rows if at the end of the day Parliament said, well, actually, we're going to reverse the decision of the British people and we're going to stay in. But barring that sort of extreme and, I have to say, unexpected decision by Parliament, if they quite say, OK, well, the British people have spoken, now we want to have our say as representatives of the British people, well, I would acknowledge that's the role of Parliament and that's what the MPs should do. If they're positive about it and so on, they need to be involved.
OK, Ellen, do you accept, though, some argue that while, yes, over 17 million said let's leave the EU, over 16 million said let's stay, and of those that said leave, many of them came out later and said that they were actually confused, that they felt a bit misled. And I personally have heard a number of voters say they'd actually like to do it again. But also you have Scotland and Northern Ireland and Londoners as well in the picture that have a huge majority voting to stay. So is it fair for you to say that there is such a clear vote in favor of Brexit?
I think it's this thing about people have changed their mind. People have changed their mind about all sorts of things. People have changed their mind other way. People who weren't very sure about it, but I were just persuaded by David Cameron they ought to go to Remain, now think, actually, yes, having our own independence back, having our own Parliament, deciding our laws for us instead of being decided in Parliament is a good idea. We're back to being a normal nation again. You know, it's no longer just a province of a sort of greater Europe. We're back to being a normal nation. So these things cut both ways, and I don't think that's the issue. I think... the government, I quite like what Theresa May is saying. She's speaking quite bluntly and quite straightforwardly, and quite rightly is saying, look, I'm not going to disclose my hands ahead of the negotiations. Why should we? And indeed, why should the government? I wouldn't expect the government to do so.
OK.
I think the other thing is the British, well, your last point, you asked about Scotland and Wales and so on. The British people in toto were asked, and the British people in toto spoke. Of course, we'd expect Nicola Sturgeon to ride upon it and try and... she wants to have a second referendum, and now she's found another reason for wanting it. But it was always going to happen, and whatever happened, as long as she was First Minister in Scotland. But she's just playing her game. There's a lot of bravado from her and so on. But
Ellen,
let her get on with it. We'll get on with the negotiations.
I'd like to get back to the Scotland, Northern Ireland, London issue in a minute. But first, let me ask Jean, you know, if the court does rule that the Brexit needs to go forward as the government in power now sees fit, should the UK pursue which strategy here, the hard Brexit option or the soft Brexit option?
I mean, I think that there is a range of options on the table, and that therefore the government does need to actually have an idea which direction it's going in. You don't shut the door until you've decided what your destination is. And this idea about you're putting forward all the nuts and bolts of what it is you're prepared to negotiate, I think is actually a sideshow. You do need to have a clear idea what it is you're trying to get. What are the goals? Do you want to stay within a single market? Do you actually want to have real access to that? Do you want to be prepared to keep some of the really good stuff, the strong environmental legislation, the quality standards? The City of London will tell you it wants to keep its passporting rights to be part of the whole sort of financial system within the European Union. And that's the sort of thing that the government now has to make up its mind on, and with some priorities within that, whether they think actually access to that market is so important to us and so important to jobs and the well-being of the United Kingdom. They want to put that against, you know, a set of trade deals where, frankly, they don't even know yet what the trade deal will be with the European Union. They can't start properly negotiating with other countries until after that agreement with the European Union is done.
Alan, you can go ahead now.
Yeah, sure. Yes and no. The government does not have the right to keep us in the single market. It's absolutely clear. Britain voted, the overwhelming majority of Britain said out. Clear, leave, out, gone. So, but however, you are right in saying, of course, the government needs to listen to people, listen to the city, listen to people in Scotland and so on, take on board their interests, farmers, fishermen and so on, take it on when it's developing that strategy. Now, Theresa May has said quite rightly, this hard Brexit, soft Brexit business is not very helpful because it's not a sort of black or white thing. It will have, within the basis of Britain coming out of the European Union, it will want to try and negotiate good deals and so on as it can, but it won't want to, and I would expect it not to disclose its hand as it goes into the negotiation. That's really rather silly, and I think Theresa May's made that point. I'm not a Conservative, but I have to say I've been pretty impressed by her so far if she does what she says. And I think she's got to play her cards close to the chest. She has to listen to everybody, listen to the Scots, listen to the Welsh, listen to the City of London, listen to everybody, listen to the fishing industry and so on. And then actually the government has to go ahead and carry out the will of the British people as best it can, negotiating the best thing. And staying in the single market is simply not one of those options. It's like saying stay in the EU. We can't. We're on the way out.
Okay, Jean, we have time for a final response from you. And if you could also address the issue with Scotland and Northern Ireland, particularly Scotland calling for another referendum to secede from the Union of the UK.
Well, firstly, let's be clear, this is not an overwhelming majority. In most places, you can't change the constitution of your darts club on something which is not a qualified majority. But in terms of what it means for Scotland, for Northern Ireland, the issue about that border, for example, between the north and south of Ireland is really important in terms of not only the economic future of those two parts of the island, but also the ongoing peace process. And people from both sides will be telling you that. For Scotland, they will say to you that they took the decision to remain within the United Kingdom on the basis of also being told that was the way to stay in the European Union. There is now a real material change there. I don't think it's at all surprising that they are considering a second referendum if they feel that, you know, they've effectively been shortchanged on the results of the first. It wouldn't be surprising at all and quite understandable.
Okay, Alan, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to give Jean the last word. I'd like to thank both Jean Lambert and Alan Craig so much for joining us on this edition of the Newsmakers.